What's up everyone, it's Nick McCullum here, and in this video we're going to be working through the practice problems on loops from my course for Python for Beginners. Now before we get started, be sure to subscribe to this channel so you can get all of my future videos showing you how to become a better software developer. With that out of the way, let's dig into these practice problems on loops. Let's start with problem 1, which says, write 4 separate for loops that print every element from the following 4 lists. Now this first list we get is a list of all of the Canadian provinces, and to loop through this and print every element we will do this. For province in Canadian provinces, print province. Now let's run this code and see what happens. As you can see, it loops through every element in the list and prints the province. Now, one important thing to keep in mind with Python lists is that this loop element here, the variable province, can actually be whatever you want. So you could say for x in Canadian provinces, print x. You could say for hello in Canadian provinces, print hello. You could say for Nick in Canadian provinces, print Nick. And as you can see, I'm sure you're getting the point. You can actually name that variable whatever you want. Now, with that said, it's important to keep in mind that you want your code to be readable to outside users, so it is considered a best practice to use something like province that actually makes sense in the context of the loop. Now, with that out of the way, let's move on to the next one, which is a list of integers. So for this one, we will say for number in integers, print integers, or sorry, print number, I should say. Now, you might look at this and say, why didn't you use integer instead of number? Well, if you write for integer in integers, print integer, it still works, but it's actually kind of hard to tell, like, what's the difference between this word and this word? You kind of have to look a little more closely. So I think it's a little bit better to use number because it's more clear that it's actually a different variable than integers. And also, you can't use int. The code would still actually run if you use int, but you can tell by the different syntax highlighting here how int is green, that int is actually a reserved word in Python that has a special meaning. So you don't want to use reserved words for your loop keywords because it actually may introduce bugs into your code that you're not aware of. So in this case, we're going to use for number in integers, print number. The next list is a list of baby names. So we will use the variable name to loop through them. For name in baby names, print name. Awesome. And the last loop, or the last list that we have to loop through is a list of car manufacturers. So we will write for manufacturer, if I can spell it, in car makers, print manufacturer. Awesome. So that's problem 1. Let's move on to problem 2. Problem 2 says, create a for loop that counts the number of even and odd integers in the list below. It should return 2 strings on separate lines that print sentences with interpolated variables that inform the user how many of each integer type are in the list. Okay, as you can tell, this is actually a pretty much significantly harder problem than problem 1. We'll start, I guess, by creating 2 variables that actually just store the number of odd and even integers that we've counted so far. And since we're creating them at the start, they will actually have an initial value of 0. So to reiterate, these variables are going to be where we increase the number if we discover an odd integer or an even integer respectively. So we'll start with those. Now we actually have to create the for loop. So we will write for x in numbers. And what goes inside this for loop? Well, we need 2 if statements. One if statement that functions if the number is odd, and one if statement that functions if the number is even. So we'll map those out here without actually putting the code in yet. If the number is odd, then what do we do? We'll say count odd increase by 1. And then on the next line, we'll say if the number is even, then count even gets increased by 1. Okay, so how do we actually tell if a number is odd or even in Python? You'll remember that when we learned about remainders earlier in this course, you can say if a number, so let's say 5 remainder 2, this will give you the number of leftover numbers after you divide this number by 2. So if you take 5 divided by 2, it actually doesn't divide evenly by 2, but 4 does. So if you take the difference between 5 and 4, you get 1. So the easiest way to test whether a number is even in Python is to say, what is its remainder when you divide it by 2? So for the odd one, the remainder when divided by 2 will be 1. So here we say x remainder 2 is equal to 1. Then we'll increase the count odd variable by 1. And then on the next line, we'll say if x remainder 2 is equal to 0, then we'll increase the value of count even by 1. So that is actually how we actually do the calculations for this example. We have to finish this off by putting 2 print statements. So They should be on separate lines, so we'll do two separate print statements. And you'll notice here it says it should return two strings on separate lines that print sentences with interpolated values. Now, that keyword interpolated variables means that we're going to have to use f strings on both of them. So we will write the number of even numbers is count even. And then on the next line, we'll say the number of odd numbers is count odd. All right, let's run this code, and with any luck, we should, sorry, this is off. It should say count odd. We'll run this code, and with any luck, this should function properly. Excellent, so we are good to go, and let's move on to problem 3. Problem 3 says, write a for loop that prints the integers from the following list, but only if they are even. Okay, so this question is a little more straightforward. We'll start by just mapping out the for loop. So we'll say for number in integers, and then we want to print out the elements of the list, but only if they're even. So once again, we'll start with an if statement that uses the remainder to test whether the number is even. So we'll say if number remainder 2 is equal to 0, then we'll print the number. Awesome. So that's problem 3. It's a little more straightforward than problem 2. Let's move on to problem 4. Problem 4 says write an infinite loop. Okay, so we saw in the lesson associated with this video that infinite loops are one of the more common bugs that are associated with while loops in Python. And to write them, you have to say while, and here in the braces, your condition never needs to get evaluated to false. And as long as it stays true forever, you'll have an infinite loop. So the easiest way to create an infinite loop is to just literally put the Boolean true value in here like this. So we'll say while true, we'll print out this course is awesome. So what happens when we run this? It prints and it prints and it prints and it prints, and it'll never stop. You can tell here by this asterisk that the code continues to run even many seconds later. So how do we stop this? You go up to the top of your Jupyter Notebook here, click kernel, and click restart. And then you'll get a pop-up that says, do you really want to restart the kernel? All your variables will be lost. We'll confirm that, and you can see now that the code has stopped running. So that's problem 4. Let's move down to problem 5. All right, so problem 5 says the factorial of any number is represented by n exclamation mark and is equal to, and then it shows you how to calculate it. The question says, given a provided integer named number, write a loop to calculate its factorial. You will need to account for the special cases of 1 factorial equals 1 and 0 factorial equals 1 as well. All right, so how do we do this? We'll start by creating a variable called fac, and this is going to be initiated at 1. Now, what is this variable? This is the variable that we're going to be multiplying the other integers against to actually get the final factorial to print out. So that's that. We'll next actually handle the special case of number is equal to 0 by just doing a hard-coded if statement. So if number is equal to 0, then we will print 1. And then we can wrap the whole rest of the logic within an else statement. Within this else statement, we will use a while loop that loops over the number variable and decrements it by 1 each time. Every time the loop iterates, we will multiply number against the factorial number, and after the loop is concluded, we will just print the factorial variable. So what does that look like in practice? We say while number is greater than or equal to 1, and then within the while loop, we will say factorial is equal to factorial times number on one line, and then on the next line, we will decrement the number variable. Number is decreased by 1. Once that loop is done, we will print the factorial variable, and this should be done. We'll test the special cases of 0 and 1 first. So 0 factorial. Oh, we're getting a syntax error. Where is this? Print 1. There should be no colon here. Let's try that again. So 0 factorial is 1. 1 factorial is 1. 2 factorial should be 2. 3 factorial should be 6. And 4 factorial, I believe, should be 24. Awesome. It looks like it's functioning properly. So that's problem 5. Let's move on to problem 6. Problem 6 says create a while loop that has the same functionality as the following for loop. So let's first run this for loop to see what it does. Okay, so this loops through every element of the furniture list and then prints a different sentence based on the contents of that list. So to create the corresponding while loop, first we have to create the incrementer variable at the start. For that, we'll use the variable name I, and we will start it at 0. Next, we have to actually write the while loop. So we say while I, and what do we want I to loop through? We want I to loop through the elements of the furniture list. So we say while I is less than the length of the furniture list, colon, and then we're going to just copy this print statement and then make a slight modification to it. So in here, we can't say item.upper because this item variable here actually refers to the for loop's loop variable. we need to replace that with a reference to the element of the list using square brackets. So furniture at I, and then we use the same dot upper method to turn the string into all uppercases. So let's run this and see what happens. Oh, okay, so this is actually an infinite loop. We'll have to restart the kernel because I made a mistake. The piece of the while loop that I forgot is I actually didn't increment the increment variable every time the loop operates. So we need to say I is plus equals 1, which just means that every time this loop operates, this variable I gets increased by the value of 1. Let's run this again and see what happens. Oh, I need to run this cell block too because I restarted the kernel. All right, so it looks like we're getting the same table, chair, desk, lamp, coach, table, chair, desk, lamp, coach. Awesome, so that's problem 6, and we are now ready to move on to problem 7. Problem 7 says write a for loop that has the same functionality as the following while loop. Okay, so we'll start this by saying for integer in integer list, and actually we'll run this code block so that we get access to the integer variable. And what does this list actually do? It looks like it takes every element of the integer list and multiplies them together and then returns that within a string. Okay, so we'll say outside of here we'll have to just create a variable called I is equal to, no, we'll say multiplier variable is equal to 1. And then for integer and integer list, multiplier variable is equal to multiplier variable times integer. And then once that loop is done, we'll print this same sentence. And I think this should give us the same string. The product of all the items in the list is 720. Awesome, so that's problem 7, and that concludes our practice problems on loops. Thanks so much for watching this video, and I invite you again to subscribe to this channel if you want more content that will teach you how to become a better software developer. Thanks again.